Well, hi everybody. Al Bernstein here with another one of our Boxing Hangouts on both Google Plus and also YouTube. We're delighted that you joined us. Today, we will have a historical bent to what we do for the most part, and we're going to have a terrific guest on hand in just a moment or two to talk about some boxing history from the turn of the century, and I don't mean this century, I mean the one before it. First, let me introduce a gentleman who is the creator and producer of these Boxing Hangouts, and generally the high potentate of everything we do. Dan Potts. Dan, how are you?
I'm awesome, Al. Thank you so much.
I could have thought of a better phrase or title than one that comes from the Ku Klux Klan. You realize that? I should something a little higher than that, no? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What are you going to do? Anyway, he's the greatest, and Dan, during the course of this, correct, we're going to have some folks during our live hangout on Google Plus who can also ask both us and our guests some questions, correct?
Absolutely. For those of you that are watching live on Google Plus, there is a question and answer button that's up there. If you want to click on that button, you can ask a question. We're going to be checking that during the course of this broadcast tonight. And hopefully we'll be able to get some, you're going to hear some really interesting information tonight, and I'm sure you're going to have questions and want to hear more about it. And we will be happy to answer those questions as we go through the process tonight.
All right, terrific. And let me say this to you also. If you have a general boxing question, toss it in there, because maybe at the end we'll if there's some questions sitting there that don't even have to do with our topic, I can still toss them in. Toss in my answers as well. Well, we mentioned that we're going to talk about boxing history, and there are often throughout the year a number of books written about boxing history. Many of more recent time, but the lady I'm about to introduce specializes in going farther back in boxing's rich history and doing great books like the ones you're seeing on the screen right now. And that is a good friend of mine who, along with Mark Scott, has written these books and others, Colleen Aycock. Colleen, how are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Al, thank you so much for having me on your show. And Dan, thank you for setting this all up. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're excited that you're here, Colleen. And I love all the stuff in your office there. You got your Smoking Joe Frazier shirt and everything. So it's very authentic looking. Now, and I mentioned we showed your fine books that you've written that you have up there, and as I said, you specialize in going pretty far back in terms of boxing history, and your book about Joe Gans goes all the way back to a period from 1890 through 1910. When boxing, had it's kind of its beginning, at least of the modern age. When does the era begin officially, when we have gloved boxers, when the bare knuckles have gone away?
Well, that's a good question. Gloves were around throughout the 1800s. You see them throughout London in England, but they really didn't become popular in the United States until the late 1880s. The Queensberry rules were the first to mention gloves, and a good rule of thumb for Americans to keep in mind is that those rules were drafted in 1865, the end of the American Civil War. An easy way to remember that. They were published in 1867, but it took a couple of decades for Americans to really catch on to glove boxing. And the definitive year for the beginning of glove boxing for Americans, I always say that because there are glove tournaments everywhere throughout the world, but for Americans it's 1892. Mm-hmm. Two things happened prior to that shows the transition. In 1889, we have, of course, the last bare-knuckle fight with Jake Kilrain and John L. Sullivan. Richburg, Mississippi, July 8th, in the middle of the summer. I mentioned again Mississippi. Reports said it was 95 in the shade. These guys are fighting 75 rounds in the direct sun, in the middle of summer. and everybody knows, I think, about that fight. I mean, it was an incredible fight. The same year, we have an early glove fight in America. We have Dal Hawkins fighting with 2-ounce gloves, and that fight with Bogan actually went 75 rounds as well. That was in San Francisco, indoors. So, you know, you have two different things happening there. But the beginning really is 1892 with the Carnival of Champions in New Orleans and in September. And what an amazing setup for that. 3 days, a Carnival of Champions. And you see the John L. Sullivan fights James Corbett, and that's for the first glove. All of these matches, all 3 matches, were for glove championships. Well, not championships, but were gloved. The John L. Sullivan and Corbett. Sullivan was old school, and that's sort of his last big fight. He was born 1858, as I recall. So he was before the Civil War. So that, again, that's how you see the difference in America. And Corbett comes along in 1866.
Yeah. So, and of course, we are told the famous movie, of course, that was done about that with Errol Flynn and Ward Bond, who looks suspiciously like John L. Sullivan, I believe. The narrative in that movie, but even though Hollywood movies seldom have the exact narrative, but the narrative in that movie is essentially true, that Corbett did represent something different, didn't he, in the boxing world?
He really was. He was new, exciting. He was a gentleman. That was his name. That was his moniker, Gentleman Jim Corbett. He represented the youth and vitality of the age. And there's so much said in that age, in those decades, about youth and vitality, and he represented all that was good in our culture of the new physical spirit. It was a new physical culture age. That's what they called it. And Corbett was that. He was the new scientific fighter. Sullivan was old school. You know, run in, smash your guy. You know, again, the difference between bare knuckle fighting and glove fighting, you know, really amazingly different. The thing about bare knuckle fighting was there were 2 really main components: boxing and wrestling. Wrestling's still huge. You've got wrestlers like Frank Gotch, you know, great wrestlers. But fighting, boxing with the Queensberry rules in glove matches says no wrestling. So that's an easy way to remember the 2 different sciences there. No wrestling. But you will see a lot of wrestling happening, stand-up, in the stand-up fights. And I know you like to play on words, Al, but the stand-up fight, you know, you've heard that phrase, he's a stand-up guy. You're square, you're fair, you're a stand-up guy. You're a stand-up fighter. And that's where that phrase that's when that phrase became popular, was when, if you were a stand-up guy, you were a stand-up boxer.
That's interesting. You know, you talk about the transition of periods, and one of the most interesting figures in of that whole era was Bat Masterson, and of course famous for his work as a law officer in the Old West, but was very a big part of boxing, as was Wyatt Earp, in fact, during those the late 1800s and early 1900s. And Bat Masterson was the timekeeper, wasn't he, in the last of non-glove matches?
Right. He was a timekeeper there. And so you have all of these men. I mean, you know, this is the Wild West. This is the American Wild West. They're moving straight from the gunfights into the ring. It's a new fight.
That's wild. That's wild. And so the Carnival of Champions, which was, as you point out, that Corbett fight, but it was really a big event with all those championship fights. And in there, we also, you know, began to see the idea of a mega event in boxing, didn't we? Something that to this day remains.
Absolutely. That, again, back to that Carnival of Champions in 1892, that was so huge. That was promoted to rival Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Boxing was huge well, throughout, but especially the town of New Orleans. And the promoters there thought that carnival would rival Mardi Gras, and in September it did. They brought in 3 great fighters. Again, John L. Sullivan lost his title, but look at what the purse was. The purse for that fight was $25,000. Winner take all.
Winner take all, no less.
Absolutely. And, that is, think about it, $25,000 in 1892.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. I mean, again, look at what the seats cost. The seats, the reserve seats cost $15.
Wow.
I mean, on those ticket prices, what can $15 buy? At that time, it can buy a wagon.
Yeah.
A man's suit, a shirt was 50 cents. A dress shirt was 50 cents. So, you were spending your wife's wood stove money to go buy a ticket at this event.
And probably some men got in trouble for buying those tickets, I'm guessing.
I'm certain that they did.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now,
one thing I want to point out about that fight, though, that is so interesting, is that everybody, tends to remember the heavyweight fight, the last fight of the 3 days. The first fight was actually Jack McAuliffe, and I'm sorry, that was had to be Kid Levine. McAuliffe, get my facts straight here, but
that's okay.
That
wasn't worry about facts here in the Hangout. They get in the way.
That wasn't a title fight because he didn't have the title, the lightweight title, but the other title fight, the second day fight, was really, really important because that was George Dixon, and he was black, and so that title changed from a white man. Well, he was fighting a white man, and so he already came in as champion. George Dixon came in as the bantamweight. He won in 1890, and the featherweight title he won, world titles, because he'd gone to Europe to get those titles in 1891. And then we have the Carnival of Champions in 1892. But he wasn't that well known. Still, there was a lot riding on this fight, money-wise, purse-wise, but he wasn't that well known in the general circles. He was in boxing circles. But when the news media got the result of that fight, that didn't sit well with the Southerners. I mean, you can imagine. Here is a description of George Dixon, who was great, beating Jack Skelly to a pulp, and then really to add insult to injury, the insult was to the applause of the crowd.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So during that period, you talk about African American champions emerging. You wrote a brilliant book about Joe Gans, you and Mark Scott, and at that time, Joe Gans was emerging as a major figure in boxing and really an astonishing fighter.
Thank you for that compliment. He was just absolutely amazing, absolutely. But we have a lot of good black fighters that were setting the stage for that. And but he came in a period when really the heavyweights, there was a lull there. The heavyweights were dull. Jim Jeffries.
Go figure that. When could that happen?
Really, it's the same thing, isn't it, Al? Yeah. When you had Jim Jeffries back there, he could beat anybody. I mean, there wasn't anybody that he couldn't beat. He fought Corbett twice and Fitz and on and on and on. So you have a period there. The heavyweights don't get exciting until Jack Johnson really comes along, and that's 8 years. Really,
so the lightweights kind of filled the breach there, didn't they?
The lightweights were amazing, and that's really when they bloom, and that's when you see, well, think about it. The average size of a man was a lightweight.
Yeah,
the average size, he didn't weigh more than 125 pounds, and you look at all these guys. I mean, they were 5'0", 5'2". Joe Gans was tall for the time. He was 5'6". And people don't realize that, but that was the average size of the man. And think of all the new immigrants after the Civil War now, it's a war-free country, and all the new immigrants coming in, and everybody put their ethnic pride on the stage.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So,
And during that period, some of the fighters, we mentioned some of the African American fighters, Nat Fleischer, who called George Dixon and Joe Walcott and Joe Gans. This bespeaks, right, the colloquial approach in race relations during that time. The colored aces. What was that relationship like?
well, he calls them the three-colored aces, and the reason they're the aces are because they were the #1 champions.
Sure.
Dixon is the bantam and featherweight, and in 1901, Joe Walcott wins the welterweight title, and then in 1902, Joe Gans wins the lightweight title. It always amazed me that he never said the four-colored aces, because what happened to Jack Johnson? I mean, I know he got a book by himself with Fleischer, but really he was, the #1 heavyweight. So it should have been, in my book, it should have been the four-colored aces.
Yes, exactly. Let's talk a little bit about one of the fights that would be an important fight during that period was Joe Gans when he took on Terry McGovern. Talk a little bit about all of what went on with that and why that's such a significant event in boxing.
Well, that was 1900 was the year for the fixed fights. The Chicago Tribune said that everyone was involved in, quote, shady dealings. Mm-hmm. And certainly that was a fixed fight. So if you want to talk about that fight in particular, the Gans-McGovern fight, that was December 13th, Friday the 13th, one of the last major fights of the year in Chicago. And Tatters All Hippodrome, and some reports said it was a huge fight. It was the end of the year, and it was a big fight. Well, and we'll talk about, why was it such a big fight? Well, there are many reasons it was a big fight. But for one thing, Terry McGovern was coming in as the featherweight champion, and he really got the top billing. Joe Gans wasn't a title holder at that time. This is 1900. And I think some of the questions you need to ask about that fight, of course, I believe that it was a fake fight. There are still people today that believe it wasn't faked at all. But I think you have to look at the whole fight and look at what was happening before and after that fight. Essentially, here were the conditions of the fight. And that goes also to the fixed fights of 1900s. Now remember, there are no boxing commissions. There's no one out there to set the stage. That year certainly prepared all the various states for laws and things to come down the pike. But this was the reason that year was known for the fake fights. And almost everybody was involved in some kind of conditions. Well, why are there conditions? Okay, the condition for the McGovern-Gans fight was that if McGovern was still standing in 6 rounds, he would be declared the winner. Now, why that? I mean, is that the advantage that he gets from being 10 pounds lighter, 2 inches shorter? All of these various things. It's all about the betting odds. And when you really look at the technicalities of this fight, I think you have to consider everything that was happening around it. Well, why is Terry McGovern fighting? Why is Terry McGovern at 124 pounds fighting a man that is 10 pounds heavier than himself? You have to think Terry McGovern was a great fighter. I don't think people today give him enough credit for that. Terry had only lost one. He's coming in undefeated, essentially. He'd only lost one fight by foul, and he didn't get the name Terrible Terry for being a wimp, and so he comes in with quite a pedigree there. But he had given up in 1900. He gave up the bantamweight title. He abandoned that, and then decided that since he was going to fight he had the featherweight title, and my guess is that he probably had wanted to fight Frank Erne, who was the lightweight titleist. Now, Frank is an interesting set of circumstances that happened in 1900. Frank Erne and Joe Gans fought in March, and that fight, in many, there are many references to that being a faked fight as well. Joe Gans quit in the 12th round from a terrible headbutt. I talk about that extensively. Mark and I talk about that in the book. But think about it, if Mark had won that fight, it would have a different set of history today. Yeah. If Joe Gans had won that, and there was a fight set up, then it's possible that Terry McGovern could have won 3 championships in 1 year, which would have been a stellar fact. Nobody'd ever achieved that. So,
hey, Colleen, quick question. I had a quick question for you. Didn't a lot of the kind of cloud that the fight was fixed have a lot to do with the wagers that were made just before the fight?
The betting odds shifted, and that's why we believe that something, and they did at the time too, was going on. Obviously, Gans was favored to win. I mean, there is no way that Terry could, with the history of all that had happened, that Terry could remain standing after 6 rounds. In a fight, the odds change, and they switch to McGovern. So there's some suspicion there. And certainly, if you look at the fight, and I hope that our guests do look at the fight.
We're getting it looks like, Colleen, it looks like your feed. Are you seeing that also, Al?
Yeah, I'm hearing it. Yeah, and I'm not hearing her. She's cutting out a little bit. Dan, maybe is this a good spot for us to look at the clip? Colleen, you there?
Yeah. They're having a hard time hearing me.
Okay. So, Colleen, what I'm going to ask you to do real quick is we're going to ask you to go and log off and log back on again. Use the same link that you had last time.
Okay.
And it'll refresh your feed.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll do that.
All right.
Okay.
And Al, you and I will sit here and chat for a minute while
Colleen logs out and logs up. That's the fun part about technology, that you can do whatever you feel like, going away, coming back.
Absolutely. Well, what's fantastic about this is that all of her information that she's talking about already. I mean, that stuff is genius. And I love all the information about, like, the way that the betting changed and the way everything just before that fight took place.
Can you guys hear me now?
I think, yes, it looks like you're back. You're good.
Well, maybe we've solved the issue, huh?
There you go.
Okay.
All right. Well, yeah. Now, Danny, you're talking about the betting and the odds and how this is affected. Is this a good time for us to take a look at that clip? And, we can't actually look at it right here.
Yeah. Well, this is what we'll put one in here.
We'll put one in here as we talk about this. So the betting odds are changing around. What was it, though, that in your mind, Colleen, made this quite clear that it was an absolute fix?
Well, you have probably one of the best punchers in history. And he's not really defending himself. He's not punching. We know that he could keep anybody at bay with a left jab. He's not doing that. And he goes down 6 times in the second round. He goes down in the first round. The other thing, Joe Seiler, the referee, said that the punches, it looks like Gans is landing punches. So when you look at that today, it looks like he's landing punches. And he clearly has a bloody mouth. In the second round of this fight, if you're looking at it, he's spitting blood on the floor. I find that interesting because he's not spitting it in the face of McGovern. But regardless, he's been hit in the mouth. So to the casual observer, it looks like Gans is really defeated.
Looks like we
lost Colleen's audio feed there.
Okay. Colleen, we're going to have you hook back up and come back in again.
All right, so Colleen will work on getting Colleen's situation set up a little bit better. This period, it's amazing when we look back on the beginning part of boxing and that period. There's a couple of things that I think are fascinating about it. One, boxing had just barely made that transition from being a bare knuckles event to having gloves. The racial part of this component was very big because people like Joe Gans and Jack Johnson, right? They were facing odds that went way beyond what was happening inside the ring, and so you had all these interesting dynamics going on during this period.
Well, and some of the commentary and the things that people wrote in the press are wow. You can't even believe that you're reading some of this stuff. But look, that's just how much the world has changed.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The New York Times. I remember when I was doing research for one of the show we used to do on ESPN, Big Fights Boxing Hour, and we were doing some things on Jack Johnson and some of the early heavyweights like Langford and other guys like that. And you'd see a story in the New York Times of all places, and they would say things like the colored boy. I mean, staggering things that in a billion years you can't imagine at any point were written. But as you say, clearly it's a function of the times or whatever. So, but it does underscore how difficult it was for those fighters to persevere through that.
Oh my goodness, and also the way that some of these people like Gans came up through a system, and I believe if I recall correctly from reading Colleen's books, they had almost a battle royale type of an environment that they used to have to fight their way out of in order to even get recognized in the first place. Yeah,
there would be a bunch of young men, and this was in his younger days. This wasn't a sanctioned boxing, of course. And they'd have to fight until somebody was standing. It was crazy, like you say, a battle royale, to be sure. Our guest, Colleen Aycock, we're getting her back hooked up here in a moment or two. I want to remind everybody, by the way, that we're going to be having a boxing hangout on the 24th of January, the Friday night, just leading into a big weekend of boxing that will be highlighted by the fight between Lamont Peterson and Thierry Jean, who will be fighting for the 140-pound title. That'll be a fight we'll have on Showtime, and we're going to highlight and preview that, plus Mikey Garcia against Burgos, another fight that'll be being held that weekend as well. So we're going to continue to bring you our hangouts on a regular basis and continue on what we started this past year.
And if we can go ahead and do take another little step a little bit further into the future, as we do already have it listed on the event page.
Oh, yeah.
February 25th, we're in for a real special treat. We've got Paul Galender, who wrote the one of my top 3 books from last year, which was that very controversial book about Sonny Liston. It wasn't just controversial; it was one of the most detailed books that I've read about boxing in a long time. Gentleman spent 30
right here in my hand.
Oh, wow. I mean, the research that he did into that book is phenomenal. And we're very fortunate to be able to have him come on and do a hangout with us on the 25th. And that also is the anniversary of Ali Liston 1.
The 50th anniversary, correct?
50th anniversary, which is
amazing.
How's that?
And one of the things that's interesting about Paul's book is that we so seldom really see something written with Sonny Liston in mind, and of course it's a biography, but when it comes to the Ali fights especially, Sonny Liston became kind of a forgotten figure, somebody that we don't get it from his viewpoint. We get things as they're skewed a little bit more to Ali and all the rest of it, but Sonny Liston was a fascinating figure who clearly was an amazing heavyweight in his time and got a late chance at a world title because he was kind of frozen out of the heavyweight crown. So it'll be a lot of fun to talk with Paul and delve into that a little bit. How are we doing on getting Colleen? She isn't back yet, is she?
We have not got her back yet.
Well, we're working on it. We'll work on it for a minute or two more here and try and get her back. One of the other things I want to mention in terms of us moving forward on these boxing hangouts is that as we go on during the course of the year, we're going to have a number of different formats that we're going to use. For instance, I'm very excited that probably in February we're going to be doing a show or two one for sure in February, where all of you folks who are technologically advanced enough to do this, and I know there are many of you, can just jump on Google Plus, right, and be on the screen and ask me a question, and we're gonna have that, aren't we?
Absolutely. We're going to do a full round around. Everybody can come on video. You can ask questions ahead of time. We're going to have you come on. You'll be able to, on video, on the recording, go right in and talk to Al and ask him any question that you like.
Yeah. So that's going to be a lot of fun. No foreign policy questions, so please, because I don't want to embarrass myself. But you can ask any boxing questions you want, and some other stuff as well, but we're going to be looking forward to that. Well, we're having a difficult time getting Colleen back here, but so what we may do, I think, is see if we can maybe get her back in the future to chat with us a little bit on some of these topics. And by the way, maybe you can toss up that graphic of her books as well, Dan, and I could remind people
absolutely
of what she has done. Colleen is just a marvelous author, along with her partner, Mark Scott. They have created some terrific books. Her most recent book, the one on Tex Rickard, is just a spectacular study of what is a very interesting man. As there you see, Tex Rickard, boxing's greatest promoter, and he was a fascinating character. Started out as a cowboy. He became a carnival promoter. Then, of course, promoted boxing. He's the person that really created boxing at what was the first Madison Square Garden. He was a fascinating man, and this book really does a great job of capturing, who he was. And you saw the Joe Gans book up there as well. Joe Gans, a transcendent figure in the early history of boxing. So, Colleen and Mark Scott do some amazing work.
I just finished that Tex Rickard book literally in the last day or so. I've now finished all three of Colleen's books, and the one on Tex Rickard was really that opened a million new eyes for me. I had no idea how many things Don King actually emulated from Tex Rickard, which wow, what all the way down to paying people cash, rather a smaller amount than what the actual amount should have been if you'd have given it to them the right way, right?
Yeah, we all remember the infamous story of what Hasim Rahman getting a suitcase full of cash that was only a fraction of the other deal that was going to be available to him, had he waited and not taken that money that was viscerally put in front of him by Don King. So yeah, Tex Rickard did a few of those things as well. Tex Rickard was an intelligent, interesting man who represented, I think, the transition of America from its Western, back in the day, from its Wild West days right through to the modern era of boxing. So go and get any of those books by Colleen and her partner Mark Scott. They're really excellent, and you will enjoy them. McFarland Press are the folks that put those out. Now, I mentioned briefly the fights we're going to have on January 25th. One of the other ones I want to mention on our Showtime broadcast that same night is Gabe Rosado taking on Jermell Charlo. That's another fight that we're going to be talking about on our Hangout on the 24th, and it's a really interesting fight. Gabe Rosado, who's lost 3 fights in a row, and you might say to yourself, well, how does that make that interesting? Well, he lost 2 of those to middleweight champions, one to Gennady Golovkin, and he moved up to 160 to face him. Lost to Peter Quillen because of a terrible cut, but it was a very even fight to that point. And then lost to J. Leon Love by the narrowest of margins. That turned out to be a no decision because Love failed his drug test. But in every one of those fights, Gabe Rosado showed his fighting spirit, and he really fought very well. And now he's coming back down to 154. And I think the real question, the burden of proof, ironically, isn't on the fighter that is coming in losing 3 fights. It's on the young fighter, Jermell Charlo, who's undefeated. Because, Dan, what we don't know is whether Charlo can compete at this level against a guy like Rosado.
Well, and speaking of a fighting spirit, guess who we have back?
She's back.
There she is.
All right.
I apologize
Colleen, how
for
are
that.
you? You made it back.
I am in New Mexico, so
Is
it's
she there? No.
Can you hear me?
I'm not hearing her.
Okay, she's here.
Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you fine, Colleen.
Okay.
For some reason, I am not, and I don't know why that is.
Okay.
I'm hearing you, Dan.
Okay. Check and see if you might have her muted, and that would be the only way. Otherwise, she'll be back on.
Can you hear me now? Dan, can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine, Colleen.
You can hear me fine?
For some reason, I'm not hearing Colleen. So
gracious.
It'll probably be. So I think maybe what we better do is pencil her in for another version of the Hangout, and then we'll continue to get some of her expertise. But we want to thank Colleen for being with us today, and we'll come back. We'll revisit some of these topics with her at a later date. And she was able to give us some great information and some great history of those early fights in the 1900s. Well, Dan, we're going to be back on the 24th, and we're going to be back with a terrific show previewing the that weekend of boxing. And tentatively, we have Paulie Malignaggi scheduled to join us on that Boxing Hangout. Now that will be
awesome.
fun. Paulie's
That'll be great.
Man, you love Paulie,
yeah.
And he loves you, I believe, as well.
All right. Mutual admiration.
He's a Dan Parks fan. Go figure, you know. And Paulie's going to be with us, and he'll of course be providing, as he always does, interesting and fun conversation and talking about those fights that are coming up over the weekend. So that's on the 24th. We're looking forward to seeing all of you there. Dan, what else do we have to tell the folks?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that everybody understands that, especially that came in for our history hangout, Colleen is just getting started, and I'm going to really recommend all of you, again, you're going to see some links after this is over down below. You're going to want to go to McFarland Publishing and click on the link that we put down there. Colleen has 3 really great boxing books that all of you need to take a look at if you haven't seen it before. Even the most seasoned boxing fan is going to find something new, something interesting, and a different angle, something you haven't heard before in her books. I'm a huge fan of this lady, and the second that we can get her back, we're gonna do Colleen Aycock Part 2. And get her back in here.
Exactly.
And then we have to talk to her about Tex Rickard, because I think you can almost do a show all itself just on Tex Rickard himself.
Yeah, we will, and that's actually what we should do, because it was the book is spectacular, and also he's such a transcendent figure in boxing, and as you point out, even some of the things he was doing and some of his approaches to promoting remain current to this day. So we will get Colleen back, and like Dan, I am I love what Colleen does, and her partner Mark Scott, in terms of writing these history books. And the next time we get around to, we'll chat with a little bit about her improbable journey from a writer of material that is certainly not boxing related to becoming one of the preeminent boxing historians. So we'll talk about all that and more when we get Colleen back. And as we said, the next Hangout's the 24th of January, so we look forward to seeing all of you then. This is Sal Bernstein, and we'll see you in just a little bit.
Catch you next time. Bye-bye.